July 2010 in Urasan Province, Afghanistan. Before sunrise, a Taliban fighter lifted his radio with shaking hands and whispered that the Australians were here, and everyone needed to fall back immediately. In the pre-dawn, darkness shapes slipped through the poppy fields like mist over water. The fighter did not fire a shot. He turned and ran, knowing his commander would understand. Everyone understood when Australians were involved. This was not rumor or exaggeration. NATO intelligence repeatedly recorded hardened insurgents fleeing the moment they realized Australian patrols were nearby. Men who had fought for years abandoned positions they swore to hold, running from soldiers they could barely see. The fear was real and confirmed through radio intercepts, captured letters, and prisoner interviews. There was something about these Australians that made them more frightening than any other force in Afghanistan. By the summer of 2010, the war had dragged on for 9 years. The Taliban had learned how to fight every coalition force. They knew how American Marines moved in armored vehicles and how to counter them with roadside bombs and distant fire before vanishing. British paratroopers followed familiar patterns. Canadian infantry operated predictably. After years of fighting, the insurgents had mastered the coalition playbook. Casualties kept rising, and bomb attacks reached record highs. The Taliban were winning the adaptation battle. One unit shattered everything they had. Learned the Australian Special Air Service Regiment operated unlike anyone else from 2007 to 2013. They carried out more than 300 direct action missions in Urasan and Kandahar. Their results were staggering. For every Australian operator killed or wounded, roughly 100 enemy fighters were killed or captured. In modern counterinsurgency warfare, that ratio seemed impossible, yet it was documented and real. Captured Taliban communications provided the clearest proof. Insurgent commanders warned their fighters to avoid Australians, and in some cases ordered full withdrawals if Australians were identified. This was extraordinary. The Taliban had stood against overwhelming American power for nearly a decade and adapted to British and Canadian forces. But when about 400 Australian commandos appeared, fighters were told to run across Afghanistan. 130,000. NATO troops operated daily. The Taliban fought them all with mixed success. Yet these Australians generated a level of fear no other force could. The reason was not better weapons or larger numbers, but something deeper about how they fought. The Australian SAS was formed in 1957, inspired by the British SAS, but shaped into something distinct during the Vietnam War. Unlike many units that expanded rapidly, after September 11th, the Australians stayed deliberately small. Only about 400 to 600 operators served at any time. Selection lasted 21 months, and more than 80% failed. Standards were never lowered. Australia deployed forces to Afghanistan in 2001, but the SAS began sustained combat in Urasan in 2005, 2006. While other nations rotated units every few months, Australians sent the same operators back again and again. Some deployed 3, 4, or 5 times to the same valleys. They learned the land, villages, and people intimately. That deep familiarity became a weapon. Their tactics broke NATO norms. Most forces relied on armored vehicles. Australians preferred to move on foot. They patrolled for 5 to 7 days. Without resupply, carrying light loads, wearing local scarves, and moving fast, a patrol might be 4 to 6 men compared to large American platoons and convoys. Their philosophy combined integration with locals for intelligence and relentless pressure. On Taliban leadership, raids were precise, based on weeks or months of patient information gathering. By 2009, NATO operations followed predictable routines. Convoys left bases, drove known routes, drew fire, called air support, and watched insurgents vanish before helicopters arrived. The Taliban had perfected this cycle. It became a costly stalemate. The insurgents had studied American tactics for 9 years. They knew helicopter response times and rules of engagement. In unison, they achieved near total intelligence dominance. Children, farmers, and spotters tracked every movement. The Kora Valley became a Taliban fortress. Repeated NATO clearing attempts failed. In June 2010, Australian SAS received intelligence on a high-value Taliban sub-commander near Kakarak. He coordinated bomb networks responsible for many coalition deaths. The compound sat in a deadly kill zone, surrounded by high ground and hostile civilians' daylight. Assault risked civilian deaths, and failure airstrikes would destroy intelligence and kill innocents. Standard tactics made success unlikely. Temperatures reached extreme levels. Communications were unreliable. Civilians and fighters were indistinguishable. Dozens of Taliban surrounded the area, and backup was far away. Every advantage favored the defenders. 4 SAS operators inserted on foot, carrying heavy packs through terrain marked impassable. They moved at night, navigating by stars, surviving on minimal water. Over 2 days, they covered more than 20 kilometers undetected in a region where the Taliban saw everything. 4 foreigners became invisible. For 36 hours, they watched the compound, documenting guards' weapons, civilians, and confirming the target never separated from non-combatants. Every normal option risked disaster. At the decision point, they chose an unprecedented approach. They would infiltrate silently before dawn without airstrikes or reinforcements. They relied on stealth, close combat, and shock. Before dawn, 3 operators reached the walls without night vision, using natural darkness and memory. Guards stood meters away, smoking and breathing, unaware. The Australians climbed cracks in the mud brick wall without equipment and dropped inside. They moved through sleeping rooms, clearing spaces silently. 2 fighters were subdued without sound. Another was restrained before he could shout. Supplies filled one room. In the final room, the target slept between 2 guards. When one guard woke, violence erupted within seconds. Both guards were killed with suppressed fire. The target was restrained alive. The entire assault took minutes. The compromise came quickly. A fighter raised the alarm. The valley awakened with shouts and gunfire. The team had to move 400 meters under pursuit by more than 50 fighters. They moved in a rotating formation, maintaining all-around security, while advancing engagements happened at distances from arm's length to hundreds of meters. They never stopped. Total rounds fired were only 73. Accuracy was decisive. The 4th operator repositioned repeatedly, providing cover. Intercepted Taliban. Radios revealed commanders ordering fighters not to pursue once they realized Australians were involved. One voice warned that they were ghosts who saw everything. A helicopter arrived on schedule under fire. The team extracted with the prisoner. The aircraft was hit, but escaped. Total mission time was under an hour. The captured commander produced intelligence that dismantled 14 bomb cells. But the larger impact was psychological. Within days, fighters refused assignments where Australians operated. Fear spread rapidly. Taliban attack rates dropped sharply in Australian sectors and rose elsewhere. Coalition leaders noticed. An American colonel remarked that whatever the Australians were doing needed to be bottled. From 2007 to 2010, the SAS conducted hundreds of missions with minimal casualties. Enemy losses exceeded hundreds killed and many captured, yet they followed the laws of war. Wounded Taliban were treated by SAS medics, even using their own supplies. One wounded fighter later said he expected death, not mercy. He was shocked that the same men who defeated him saved his life. NATO later studied these operations. When findings were released years later, they showed Australians achieved disproportionate strategic effects. They made up a tiny fraction of deployed forces, yet accounted for a major share of high-value captures. Taliban planning documents later instructed fighters to avoid Australian patrols entirely. Headquarters relocated to areas without them. Fear became doctrine. Other special forces adopted Australian methods. Even the British SAS adopted practices from their former students. But the approach required patience, elite training, and could not be scaled easily. Taliban propaganda shifted, avoiding references to Australians. Training manuals warned never to engage them at night or in close combat. Personal stories illustrated the cost. An Australian sergeant on his 4th deployment played a key role, firing with perfect accuracy. He later retired quietly and worked helping at-risk youth. The captured Taliban commander had once been a teacher driven to war by loss. He admitted he had never feared other forces, but believed he was already dead when Australians appeared in his room. Losses still occurred. One young trooper was killed by a roadside bomb in 2011. His death shocked the regiment. His family later created a scholarship in his honor. Recruited Taliban fighters described morale collapsing when Australians were rumored nearby units deserted without a shot fired. In later years, Australia formally recognized the SAS with unit citations and gallantry awards, many remaining classified. The public largely remained unaware. Then controversy followed. Investigations found credible evidence of unlawful killings by some members. Medals were revoked, reforms launched, and the legacy became complex. Extraordinary effectiveness existed alongside grave failures. Despite this, Australian tactics permanently shaped global special operations doctrine. Small teams, deep cultural knowledge, and minimal signature became the model. At the SAS Memorial in Perth, names are carved without detail. Quiet professionalism remains the ethos. After the Taliban returned to power, many Afghans who worked with Australians fled to safety.